Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel, and to those of you joining us via the live stream, thank you for being here. Before I introduce our esteemed panel, I just wanted to once again thank everyone for being here and to let you know that we will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the session. So please be prepared to ask your questions. We will have a mic runner come over. We want to make this conversation as interactive as possible. So my name is Stephanie Mehta. I am the CEO and Chief Content Officer of Mansueto Ventures. We are a publishing company that puts out Fast Company and Inc. magazines, and I'm delighted to be your moderator, in no small part because in an earlier life I was a telecommunications reporter, and so the topic of digital inclusion is very near and dear to my heart, as it is to our panelists. The whole topic of digital inclusion is something that has been a through line throughout this World Economic Forum annual meeting, in particular because while we have begun to really address the issues of connectivity, something like 95% of the world now has access to the internet, we still see big pockets of the world, some 3.2 billion people who live without broadband, who live within broadband, but are not accessing digital platforms. And so we're going to have a conversation today about how we close that gap. To help me with that conversation, I'm joined by Devin McGranahan, who is the CEO of Western Union, Minister Paula Ingabire, who is the Minister of ICT and Innovation for Rwanda, Rima Qureshi, who is Chief Strategy Officer at Verizon, and she is also the Deputy Chair of the EDISON Alliance, and Achim Steiner, Administrator, UN Development Program. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with Achim. Tell me a little bit about why the UN Development Program is so focused on the topic of digital inclusion. Why is that core to the development mission?
Thank you, Stephanie. Very happy to join you, and with everybody on this panel, I think we will be speaking to the same set of realizations. First of all, digital is changing everything, including in everything to do with development. So I think any organization that does not appreciate the significance, first of all, of disruption, of transition, and of newly emerging opportunities will become really redundant to where countries, economies, governments, entrepreneurs, investors have to make fundamentally different calls to perhaps where they even were just 3 years ago. So as an institution, we certainly had to invest heavily in the digital literacy. As you know, in the United Nations system, we also have our sister agencies, the International Telecommunications Union, which led a lot of the thinking about how does, and actually Doreen Bogdan is here, led the thinking already with the Broadband Commission about how do you make sure that something that is transforming virtually every aspect of our daily lives, of our economic opportunities, does not leave behind a significant number of people. And if you're a development economist and you look at the sheer exponential curve of change and differentiation between those who have access and those who don't, you're not only dealing with something that we traditionally in development refer to as leaving no one behind, you're actually condemning people to be excluded from an entirely shifting economy. That is one aspect. I've just come from another session which dealt with this phenomenon of just transition also in the context of energy transitions. And I think digital and energy are the two revolutionary variables that are changing virtually every aspect of how our economies have evolved over the last 100, 150 years. And Professor Neri Woods, who some of you may know, the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, made a very profound remark there, which is in the way that we manage these transitions. They're certainly not new. We have lived through the Industrial Revolution, many other things. I mean, this is not a phenomenology we're dealing with. It's just a very different, and in scope and scale, very different phenomenon of transition. What does just transition mean? Is it just those who were brilliant enough to think of an algorithm and suddenly control 80% of a particular segment of the market? Is that where we want to be? Well, classic economics already answered that question 100 years ago. We regulate for oligopolies, for monopolies, in order for markets to function. So for societies to function, we have to look also at how we invest in just transitions. And this is really at the core of our work today. And for example, with my dear colleague and friend Paula, we learned together, for example, in Rwanda, how do you shape a digital ecosystem? How do you invest in digital public infrastructure? Because Neri's point was governments don't handle complexity very well, but they need to set the regulatory frameworks, the incentives that then allow citizens, entrepreneurs, finance to essentially deal with the complexity of inventing these new platforms and opportunities. But a core role of government is also to ensure equity and access, so digital public infrastructure and digital public goods, become a centerpiece of thinking about that emerging digital economy, which is not the preoccupation of a programmer or of the next Amazon or whatever it might be. And I think therein lies the core preoccupation that we have as UNDP today, which is to make sure that something that is transforming the lives of billions does not create another, in a sense, setback in leaving billions behind. And I think that has a lot to do with the way you think of these transitions. They are not just ingenuity of those who invent digital services or programs. It's also how algorithms are used. And I just give you a last example. We are heavily investing in the issue of insurance in development. Insurance as a means and risk finance to deal with the fact that poor people carry heavy risks, but the market doesn't offer them a way to insure themselves against risk. Interesting enough, artificial intelligence, risk pricing, actuarial science have catapulted into a whole new era where suddenly we're able to design with the private sector insurance products that deal with micro-health insurance for the poor. And when you realize that 40% of those who fall back into poverty when they've escaped it do so because of health crisis in your family, then you realize that you suddenly have found another tool in combating poverty. So I hope these provide a few reasons why we are so focused on digital in development.
No, that's great context. And I do want to turn to Minister Paula in just a moment to talk a little bit about how the government in Rwanda is addressing some of the challenges that Achim mentioned. But Rima, let me ask you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you have seen from your perch at Verizon, which has been in the business of bridging the digital divide from an infrastructure perspective for many, many years. What are some of the challenges that you see preventing those 3.2 billion people from accessing digital applications and devices?
Thank you. So I think the first point to keep in mind is this problem exists everywhere. So this isn't a problem that exists in one geography. We have the problem as much as Verizon in the US as we do in other locations in Africa. So we have these deserts, we have the same challenge, we have aspects of the overall population, regardless of where you are, that don't connect and are not part of the digital economy. In the past, it was about we don't have the connectivity and therefore we can't get online. And I think it isn't as simple as that, because if you look at it from that perspective, if 95% of the globe is covered with connectivity, why is it that there's 3 billion people that are not connected? So that's where we have to dig into, where is that problem? Why is it that there's still 3 billion people that are not connected? And that is the focus of what we are trying to do with the EDISON Alliance, is to break it down, to say there is the accessibility component, which is the connectivity, and we know how much of the world is connected. But then there is the affordability component. Are the devices that you need actually affordable? And as we work with the EDISON Alliance, and for example, in the case of Rwanda, how many people can actually afford the devices that you need to be able to connect to the internet and to be part of the digital economy? It's quite significant. And that is a huge barrier, and that's one of the things that we are focusing on. And then last but not least is the usability. Do you actually have content in the language that you are trying to connect to, and do you have the applications and the use cases that you need? So you cannot only say, you've got the network, therefore the problem is solved, because we know the problem isn't solved. You have to dig into all of those other aspects and work on it, and that is what we're trying to do with the EDISON Alliance. And right now, one of the biggest hurdles that we're trying to tackle is that affordability challenge.
Which is a great transition to what the minister is doing in Rwanda. You have identified affordability as a challenge. How did you dig into, as Rima said, that issue, and what are some of the solutions you've come up with to address affordability?
Thank you. And maybe before we talk about affordability, I think I wanted to sort of echo some of the points that Rima has shared, starting with the one around access. I think for a long time, many governments, but also industry players, when we are reporting on statistics around access, a lot of the times we're looking at basically coverage. And when you even go a layer below, you're looking at population coverage versus geographic coverage. And so a lot of the statistics, even when you find many countries that are way, with COVID-19, it's been really the silver lining with so many investments and accelerated investments that are being made to just ensure that at least everyone is covered by some form of broadband network. And so when you think about most countries having more than 80%, 90% coverage, and you drill down, a lot of it is still going to be at the population level. Yet what we want to see is geographic coverage, because there's a lot of mobility that is happening, across the board. So I think further investments will continue to be made even for some of those populations that still live in places that remain uncovered, but at the same time ensuring that we're really talking about geographic coverage and then thinking about the quality of service, because I think it's not just enough to have coverage, it's also really the quality of service, the strength of the network and the signal that users are able to get. Now, moving to the one around affordability, which again, affordability is one of the two main challenges when it comes to tracking both the coverage gap versus the usage gap. And coming back to the context that you shared at the beginning of this session, where you have so many people, the 3 billion that we're talking about, that are living in areas of coverage but they still remain unconnected. And so you have affordability on one side, whether it's affordability of devices, but also affordability of the service. And then on the other hand, you have digital literacy skills, basic skills on how you can benefit from the content that Rima mentioned that is really being put out, to empower lives, to transform lives, to transform service delivery across both public and private sector. Now, with very specifically on affordability, again, as Rwanda, what we've done, our household categorization is already done according to income levels. So we already have a good sense of how much of our population or how many households within our population are able to afford a basic device like a smartphone. Now, it's one thing that the price is still very high. I mean, if you want a very good smartphone, you're talking about $60 to $100. Now, this is going to be competing with some of the basic needs that any household is going to want to have. But at the same time, as a government that is putting a lot of effort to digitize services to make sure that whether it's healthcare services, education, financial inclusion, everything, we're using digital as a foundation to drive access to some of these services, we cannot afford to ignore the fact that we still have a big percentage of our population that still can't afford some of these services. Now, what we're doing is really a couple of things that we want to test and try and really figure out what can work. The first one is around how do we make devices more affordable? Now, there are many schools of thought. There is a school of thought around can we make affordable device, low-cost devices for some of the emerging and developing economies, but there's also a school of thought around how do we think about innovative financing models. So many parts of the African continent, Rwanda not excluded, if you want to buy a device, any device, even a basic feature phone, you have to pay the full cost upfront. Not so many people can afford to do that. But if we're able to allow for installment payment, maybe you want to pay for a phone over 24 months, over 12 months, 18 months, 6 months, depending on what you can afford, then you make it very affordable or very easy for most of the people that couldn't necessarily afford to pay $100 upfront to really access this particular tool that is going to enable them to really meaningfully participate in the digital economy. So this is one thing that we're really working with. But even as we do the innovative financing models, we want to couple it with it's what we call bundled services. You don't want a citizen who can't afford a $100 phone to worry about paying $5 every month for the phone and then think about another $5 for the service, whether it's voice, data services that they need to make use of this device. And so really creating those partnerships that allow for us to provide a bundled package. You walk in, you get a phone with all the services. Maybe instead of paying $15 to 3 different people, you're paying 12 or 10. And so these are the models that we're experimenting with our partners and then using our Universal Access Fund to heavily subsidize that cost so that at least we can then make sure that affordability is achieved for our citizens.
Thank you. Devin, we've talked about affordability, accessibility, financial literacy. What are some of the other barriers you're seeing at Western Union that are preventing the unbanked from accessing the kinds of financial services that will really help drive inclusion?
Thank you. I think everything that we've just talked about is a foundation for driving financial inclusion, right? And financial inclusion is a systematic problem, whether it's at a country level, a region level, a city level. And it does start first with access. You need broadband and a device. But there's 1 billion people who don't actually have an ID. They don't have a recognized legitimate identity that to be in any financial transaction, you need an identity. So just at the access level, you have a systematic problem to solve. Above that, then there's an ecosystem level. You have to be able to have the infrastructure to have the transfer of value. So once the value is in your mobile device, you actually need to be able to do something with it, right? And so, and most of these problems have to be solved in ways that are different than they were solved in the Western world. So much more P2P, much more QR code based, different kinds of infrastructure. So in the United States, there's 176 ATM machines for every 100,000 people. In Uganda, there's 4 for every 100,000 people. So just even accessing cash, in which these societies are still many times cash-based, if it's in a digital system and there's no way to get cash out, that makes the ecosystem less valuable. So there's an ecosystem component that has to get critical mass before people want to participate in it, and they have to be able to transfer value in and out of both the physical and the digital world seamlessly and cost-effectively. On top of that, which is the one we spend a lot of time thinking about, is the trust barrier. People care about their money a lot. There's a lot of distrust for traditional financial services, in some cases governments, and the unknown of what happens if my money's not in my hands, right? And so the trust barrier is enormous in many places. Even if you have the infrastructure and you have access, getting people to trust the system to leave their money in the system, which then comes, you talked about digital literacy, financial literacy, right? You have to actually understand how to manage your money and how to use the different tools and capabilities, which then ultimately leads to preference. And if you can get people to want to behave this way, to want to interact this way, again, it's a systematic problem. So it starts building on itself, more people involved, you get network effect. You have a device, I have a device, I can transfer value cost effectively to you. That becomes more efficient and you develop preference. And so you actually have to work through that in almost every place you're trying to drive from, you know, a cash-based economy to a digital financial services economy.
Just a reminder that we're going to go to questions from the audience in about 15 minutes. So if you have something you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, we'll go to you and make this a more interactive conversation. Devin, let me stick with you. So you've laid out what some of the challenges are beyond the affordability, accessibility, digital literacy. What are some of the things that you and your peers in financial services are doing to try to bridge those gaps?
So there are 2 or 3 things that are really, really, really important. One is you have to change the cost paradigm. So traditional financial services, traditional banking systems with traditional infrastructure are exceptionally expensive. And then that poses a burden on minimum balances and fees and all the conversations we just had about accessibility. So working to deliver accessible financial services in a very cost-effective and therefore digital platform is first and foremost paramount to driving financial inclusion. The second is creating the education to drive financial literacy and the awareness. So in my business, where we have a 2-sided network, we have senders and receivers. Having the sender, so in my business, on any given month, we have 10 million people who originate a digital cross-border remittance. 82% of those are paid out in cash, right? So the sender is digital, the sender has access, the sender many times is in a developed economy. Having the senders create the impetus for receivers to receive that digitally, to receive it in a wallet, to enable the 2-sided participants to drive adoption and to drive trust in the system. And then the third comes back to this notion of the network effect. And so we've spent a lot of time around the world, whether it's with Bcash, whether it's with Paytm, integrating into the alternative wallet ecosystems so that someone who wants to send a remittance now has a receptivity and ability to receive that digitally in many, many economies around the world. So starting to build those ecosystems where you can send and receive digitally, again, that is really important, which is the ability to transfer value. And as soon as you start building network effect on the transfer of value, you can then get critical mass and start to get people enrolled. So those are the three most important.
Minister, you talked a little bit about the government in Rwanda subsidizing some of the expense and addressing affordability that way. What other policy interventions are you engaged in that seem to be really effective?
So a couple of policy innovations. I want to pick off on the question around digital financial services, and then we can talk about the other policy interventions we're putting in place. The first one is really the recognition that digital technologies, connectivity are the foundations of driving financial inclusion. Today, even taking an example of Rwanda, but even when you look across Africa, what you see is that the mobile technology has really been a game changer in terms of how we drive financial inclusion. We have about close to 68% when you look at digital financial services that are driven by mobile, technologies. A lot of it is still backed by USSD, and I think some of the policy changes that we're coming in with is sort of in terms of having meaningful digital financial services. How do we transition from a basic technology like USSD to thinking about, creating apps around some of these services that then also create the value proposition that Rima was talking about for people to transition from feature phones to smartphones, because they see these value-added services that come with the need that one is trying to address. So that's one. Also on digital financial services is the cost. You did talk very well about the cost element. What we continue to see, and a lot of it is the perception, where people feel like because they can see the transaction cost that goes with every transaction they make, whether it's a P2P transaction or a merchant transaction, automatically they'll not relate with how much am I paying for cash, to use cash, whether it's using public transport means to go to a bank to deposit or to get some money from the bank. That kind of education and awareness is required for people to be able to compare that and understand that digital financial means could be a better alternative. But I think there's more work that we're trying to do, even for us as policymakers, together with the central bank, to figure out how do we even lower further this transaction cost so that the adoption rate is even much higher than the alternative, which is cash in many cases. Then, in terms of digital literacy, which is really the other barrier around the usage gap, what we've done is to create what we call the Digital Ambassadors Program. So what we're doing is to, hire thousands of digital ambassadors that we place in the different communities, particularly in the rural communities. They become the link for many people that still do not yet afford to connect in order to be able to get these services, whether it's access to digital services, government services, financial services. But essentially, that is a short to mid-term solution. Essentially, what we want is to empower every individual, every citizen with the ability to access these services on their own. But before we get there, it's really being able to train them on basic digital literacy skills, how to access the different platforms that government has put in place to access all the services, how to access the various financial services that are in place. Then the third policy intervention really then comes back to, whether it's the broadband policy efforts of how do we revise this, how do we make the market more attractive, how do we make it very competitive, what are the kind of players that we bring on board to ensure that really we can close on this gap in a very meaningful way. The partnerships that we need to forge, and I think today we have Rima and Akim, who both of us, all of us are part of the EDISON Alliance, where we are able to bring all these partners. So it's not just the partnerships to bring in the resources to close on these gaps, it's also the ability to share some of the experiences and the successes that are happening in the different parts of the world. Then you have the Broadband Commission, you have ITU, where we still have many of these partnerships that are being formed, whether it's a government to government, government to private partners. And I think it's such platforms that are so important for us to be able to drive the kind of progress, but also the policy interventions that we would like to see and really look at the impact that is being created on the ground.
Rima, can you talk a little bit more about that collaboration? We have private sector, government, development all represented on the stage, and right now we've been talking kind of in our individual lanes. What is the EDISON Alliance doing to drive that collaboration, and can you share some positive outcomes or some case studies about how that collaboration has really accelerated inclusion?
Yeah, I would say to begin with, that collaboration is fundamental and it's essential, because we have individually tried to solve these problems for many years. And the key success to being able to actually deliver on that digital inclusion is to ensure that we have the kind of representation that you see up here. It doesn't work otherwise. And the way that we are doing this is through the EDISON Alliance. We've created the concept of champions. So when we put forward the EDISON Alliance, it was clear that there are certain institutions, either public or private, that need to be part of the solution. So we actually reached out to them and asked them to join the Alliance. And we've also asked all of these members and champions to make commitments towards that 1 billion goal. So it is very concrete. It is something that we are following up very closely, and we are following up to ensure that we are actually affecting change, that we are impacting and improving the lives, and that is through that collaboration. So as an example, we regularly have champions meetings where we get together and we share our commitments. We had one here yesterday. The objective of that is for each one of the champions, or those that want to speak up, to talk about what are the initiatives that they're working on. It is an opportunity then to determine what are they missing. So as an example, yesterday we had a discussion in India where there is an initiative on the healthcare side, but they are missing certain aspects to be able to provide that solution and scale it. You can only do it to a certain extent, but to really be able to scale it across and get the benefit, you need government, or you need the operator, or you need somebody else. By getting everybody together in that champions community, we are then able to put the relevant actors together to try to solve the problem. So as a next step in in India, we are asked to bring all of these together, all of these actors together as the EDISON Alliance to try to make sure that we're able to scale. So that's an important aspect of what we are doing, which is different, and which we hope will then be able to concretely demonstrate that we are able to generate these results. A very other important fundamental pillar of what we are doing is the solutions that we are providing have to be economically, commercially viable. Otherwise, it becomes a side project, and it will never scale. So that doesn't mean that we have to generate profit on day one, but it is about a solution that will naturally become scaled, because there is a financial benefit in the long term. And that is an important fundamental pillar of what we are trying to do. So it becomes part of the central business instead of something that you do as a pilot project on the side. And we are trying to make sure that we find those solutions. So in the case of connectivity and accessibility and ensuring that you make it viable, it isn't about one aspect of the overall value chain that has to bear the brunt of it. It has to be a solution that works holistically. So what does the government do? What do the enterprises do? What do the individuals do? And how do you solve the problem, as in the case that we talked about with microfinancing? So it's like looking at different models, but that still commercially will be viable. So those are some examples of the approach that we are trying to take, and concretely hope that this will help us realize our 1 billion lives goal.
Achim, I'd ask you a version of the same question. You have an incredible perch from your role at UNDP. What do you see working especially well?
I think it is when the different capabilities and competencies are, in a sense, brought together, and when you also design not just for singular problem solving. Let's be very clear, this digital revolution is a very steep cost curve in terms of investment. I mean, the device is one. Once you have maybe, fiber optic cable in much of Africa, many people cannot afford to use it because it's expensive. So we need to design solutions that are, from the beginning, meant to address precisely that risk. I'm not disagreeing with Rima, but I would take a slightly different paradigm. Not everything that is worthwhile doing is necessarily commercially viable, particularly at a certain stage of development. Rwanda has a fund to deal with that. Let me give you another example. We're also looking very much at the sort of idealized end that everybody has sort of the universe in their palm. In Bangladesh 10 years ago, we set out in a partnership with the government to create access to information, a very successful initiative called A2I. It's really the foundation of e-government, going out and reaching people in the villages. The idea was not to try and immediately get everybody an expensive smartphone, but rather to establish terminals where no citizen would be living further than 4 miles, I think it is, from such a digital terminal. Because what we underestimate is how much people spend, either directly in cash or in time foregone that they could be earning money, to just get registration certificates, ID, land titles, and so on. We estimate that the impact annually of having now, and really it's Bangladesh's extraordinary achievement, put in place a coverage across the entire nation, that probably $3 billion of people's income is essentially saved every year because they don't have to go to a provincial capital, don't have to spend 2 days queuing up, maybe paying some fees, that shouldn't be paid to get a certificate. So here's a great example. Technology was there. Some technology companies were fundamental to Bangladesh's sort of imagining its future into the digital era. But then government set up a system that no company would have paid for. After a while, though, these digital terminals have now become so attractive that many companies are using them as platforms on which to offer services, banking services and other services. So there is sometimes a chronology. I'll give you another example. These are very real-life examples. Antiretroviral drugs. The Global Fund plays a crucial role in helping countries access antiretroviral drugs. UNDP plays a significant role in helping countries to then really have them reach patients. We began a small program. It cost less than 1% of the cost of the actual drugs to solarize rural health centers with photovoltaics, because many of these health centers were not connected to the electric grid yet. What happened is that you took a health initiative, combined it with access to electricity. Suddenly you could monitor stocks in these rural health centers, because with digital infrastructure, you can connect the most remote health center to a central place where you monitor the amount of vaccines, for example, which became critical during the COVID pandemic. And if you don't think of these opportunities, then the cost of doing these things separately is insurmountable. Put together, suddenly $1 delivers three wins. And that's why I think the work that we do as UNDP today, first of all, helps government look quickly at what do we already have in place. We call it digital readiness assessment. And it goes right up to the question, do we actually have legislation that protects privacy, data, fundamental rights against hate speech, as much as it is about the financial system? And then secondly, we help countries to understand where is it that the government has to step in, particularly in an early stage of creating the digital public infrastructure. We look also at this extraordinary universe out there, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel every day. There are digital public goods that if you don't know about them, you may spend a lot of money developing them when in fact they are there in another country. So we're also part of a landscape, if you want, with many others to connect that extraordinary curve of innovation that's happening. And that all brings down the cost, may make it commercially more viable early on, but does not begin by saying only those who can afford to pay are part of the journey.
Can I just add something? And maybe commercially viable is a term that might be misinterpreted. I think it is, how do you incentivize? How do you incentivize to ensure that this is something, whatever we are doing, is something that will scale? And how do you balance regulation with incentives? And that's the balance that I think we need to strike. And we understand that it isn't something that will be viable to begin with, but it is to create that incentives to get that implementation done.
Scale and sustainability.
Right.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in just 1 minute, but before we do, Devin, I wanted to just quickly ask you about, and Achim referenced this, security. In order to have trust, especially in financial systems, you need to make sure that the transactions are secure. This is something that Western Union has been working on since almost its inception. Just talk a little bit about the importance, and this is maybe a second order issue, you have to get the access first, but then once people have access, in order to trust the system, they need to know that the money will not be defrauded.
Yes, and I would separate transaction security, which is relatively easy to enable in modern financial services systems, from people who perpetrate fraud in digital financial services, right? And so we spend a lot of time ensuring, and that comes back to the identity, KYC, being able to understand who the participants are in that transfer of value, and that in fact it is a legitimate transaction with legitimate and acknowledged actors on both sides of that transfer of value. Otherwise, you create the opportunity for massive amounts of consumer fraud, because digital identities can be fake, or they can people can perpetrate scams on less educated or less digitally sophisticated people, which is way, way easier in a digital environment than it is in a physical environment. So really protecting the participants and ensuring that known actors are interacting with known actors in secure ways is really important.
Great. We have a mic runner here. Do we have any questions? Yes. If you could stand up and identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Cynthia McCaffrey, and I lead UNICEF's office in India. And I wanted to ask, is there concern around girls' and women's access? So in the country where I work, around 33% of women and girls have regular or real access to the internet versus over 57% of boys and men. If you agree that we need to have our eye on that, what are the policies, the tools, the investments that we need to make sure that girls and women have that access? Because it affects girls' learning, their employability down the line, as well as the banking that they can have in the future.
Great question. Does someone want to take that?
I can start. One of the important priorities that we have is to focus on women and to ensure within the EDISON Alliance that we have programs and pilots and projects that are focusing on ensuring digital inclusion for girls and women.
And maybe I can share some of what things that we're doing, especially around the device side. So earlier I did talk about what we're doing in terms of using household data to understand which of those households are going to find it very difficult to own a device, a smartphone. We've been able to also disaggregate that data down to the level of understanding how many of these households are female-led, because you have the kind of female-led household, but also at the same time to understand if even for those male-led households, how do we ensure that it's not just one phone per household? Maybe we should do 2 smartphones per household. So you have both the mother and father of the household at least owning a device, because if you just give it to one person within the household, chances are that it's either going to end up in the hands of the male lead or maybe the older son within the family. So when we did a pilot before the pandemic started, one of the things that we were very intentional about, because we were doing a campaign that we called Connect Rwanda, and we wanted to really create awareness around the value proposition of a smart device and really get all different stakeholders to rally behind that. So during the campaign, we were able to mobilize about 46,000 smartphones that people gave, and the idea was that we give them out to these different households that really we knew that for the next 5 to 10 years they may never be able to afford a smartphone. And we're very intentional about making sure that there was a good 50-50 split between female and male, so that at least we are able to also track impact on the ground and how many after a year still own that phone, and if they do not, why? Because those are some of the that's some of the feedback on the ground that allows us to go back and rethink some of the strategies and policy interventions that we're putting in place. Now, when we get into the schools where we're putting smart classrooms and ensuring digital literacy, we also ensure that at least there's that split where you're not going to get into school and say we're only going to, have computer training classes for just the male students versus the female students. So So it's the ability to make sure that every student in a school at least has on average 3 to 4 hours within that smart classroom, and making sure that all the students that get into the smart classroom environment can be targeted. But to your point, Rwanda is very big on gender empowerment and really making sure that we are inclusive. And we're not just looking at the gender piece, we're also looking at people with disabilities, because that's also a very special segment where the kind of devices we're talking about, people with disabilities will need a whole different kind of tool and different skills to be able to access. So these pockets of the population are things that we are able to disaggregate with data and allow us to have better targeted interventions when it comes to the digital economy.
Great. We have a question here in the front and then one in the very back. Can we start here?
Hi, good morning. I'm Carla Gomez-Briones. I'm a global shaper from Ecuador. And digital skills and connectivity is one of the most critical aspects that we need to work for micro and small enterprises. After COVID-19, we have seen a lot of disruptions, and additionally, we have seen that a lot of MSMEs were forced to close their operations. So how do you see the role of your institutions, or what we are doing to support the MSMEs that at the end are the engine of development?
Someone want to grab the question about microenterprises? Akim.
Let me take you to a very extreme setting for a moment. Afghanistan, January 2023. A government that is not recognized by anyone, a central bank that has imploded, an economy that is in free fall, and 80,000 micro-enterprises that are led by women. How do you respond at that moment? Because as we often see in these situations, the response is to say, well, we're not going to deal with that country. We will give some humanitarian aid, but otherwise we disengage. We took a very different decision last year. It was one of the most difficult ones we had to take, because we essentially decided as a development organization not to continue development in the traditional sense. But we did decide to stay and deliver, because what we could foresee was a country that was going to implode. And indeed, as predicted, 95% of Afghan citizens today live in extreme poverty. It's a catastrophe. But there is a digital infrastructure, and compared to 20 years ago, you are able to reach women today. You are able to make cash transfers. And so what we began to build up was a direct cash transfer program that allows us to directly reach women entrepreneurs. And surprisingly, these 80,000 women-led micro-enterprises are the backbone of literally millions of people's livelihoods, because in every household that a woman leads, and sometimes they're women-headed households, there are 6 to 8 people. Each one of these micro-enterprises employs 3 to 4 people, so you can do the math. Suddenly, in a situation where essentially we would have abandoned these people, we can, with very little money, give them precisely the means by which, with their own ingenuity and survival capacity, to earn a minimum livelihood, to get through what at the moment looks a terrible period in which survival is literally a matter from day to day. But that is the combination of new ways of responding to crisis, leveraging technology, but also knowing who the people are that you want to reach. So it's an extreme example, and you could take it to many others, I think, as well. The pandemic taught us, I think all of us, UNICEF and NGOs and governments, a lot about how to be able to target, identify, reach people with critical stimulus packages, sometimes temporary basic income, to allow a micro-entrepreneur or a small enterprise to simply survive for a moment and then recover. It's so much more effective, so much more dignified, and so much cheaper than anything else that we have traditionally used when we found ourselves in those crises.
It's a great example. We have time for one last question. Our friend in the back.
Hi, my name is Mariam Nouria Kone. I'm a global shaper, software engineer, and tech entrepreneur from Côte d'Ivoire. And my question basically has 2 layers. I'm trying to address the gender gap in the tech industry in Côte d'Ivoire specifically. And the first question is, how do you address the bias that people have about basically women in technology, women not being maybe smart enough or not being at the right place, or supposedly have to have a lot of household responsibilities that should not allow them to be in the tech field? And secondly, when I think of Africa, there's also an access issue, because when we talk about, for example, mobile penetration, internet penetration, it's mainly the capital cities. When you get into the country, you have less and less access to digital and to basically infrastructures, because when we talk about digital literacy, it means that you actually have access to the devices or to the connectivity to get that digital literacy. So yeah, those are my questions.
Rima, as our woman on tech, do you want to take the woman in tech question? And then Paula can take part two.
To help as well. First of all, great questions, and more power to you, and any kind of help and support you need. First of all, I have 2 daughters, and I have myself, as a software engineer by training, gone through a lot of the same challenges, not in Côte d'Ivoire, but in Canada and the US. So those types of challenges exist everywhere. And it is through mentoring, it's through role models, it's through examples, it's through the support, the kind of things that we are trying to do here to create those programs that provide that type of support. I have 2 daughters, and I'm trying to make sure that they also have those abilities, and we need to make sure that we provide those abilities regardless of where you are located. And we need to create those opportunities in the rural areas as well as in the others. So we need to figure out ways to incentivize that initial ability to connect is there to start with, and then we ensure that we provide those opportunities. I've always said to my daughters, you can do anything you put your mind to, and I think we need to just make sure that we give those opportunities to women to do that.
Thanks, Rima. And I think I wanted to touch on that, but I think you've extensively covered that. It's finding the right role models, but also starting very early. I think it's difficult to tell a 20-something-year-old to try and empower them and motivate them. But when you start at 3, and when they're still creative, when they don't know about these biases, then I think it's easier to build a larger pipeline of more women that are going into STEM field. And I feel like we're there where most people are really recognizing the need for that, because it's not just a bias. It's also really the implications when it comes to the kind of solutions that are built that will also exacerbate these biases in the way that they're built. I think yesterday Doreen and I were in a session where we're looking at the cyber gaps, and you could tell only 25% of the global cyber workforce is women. So what does that mean when it comes to the kind of tools that are being deployed to protect people, and there's just a lack of diversity in when you're looking at some of these professions. But I wanted to come back to your second question, which is really around access, and that's why earlier on I did mention the shift from just looking at population coverage and more around geographic coverage, because when you're only measuring population coverage, most likely you're focused on the urban areas, because that's where the population density is quite high. But when you start to shift your approach and strategy towards geographic coverage, then it becomes less of where do we have more people, which is most likely going to be in the urban areas, the secondary cities, but rather really looking more broadly at even the rural communities. Now, of course, the strategies that you deploy for access in urban areas is going to be quite different from what you do for the rural parts of the country. It also requires more incentives, more subsidies to ensure that the quality of service you will find in an urban setting is similar to what you will find in a rural setting, but also understanding the purchasing power of people and figuring out all these different incentives that we were saying that have to match some of the regulations. So I think it's the biggest challenge any policymaker will continue to have, to really ensure that as we think about meaningful connectivity, not leaving anyone behind, the bulk of those people are really the ones that are living in the rural settings all over different countries. Maybe just to use 30 seconds to come back to the question that she asked around MSMEs, and I think for all of us, SMEs are the backbone of our economies. I saw the Minister of Singapore, she left just a while ago, she was in the audience, but I think they've started a program which we're trying to also implement, but many other countries are doing, which is called MSMEs Go Digital. In Singapore, they even have one that they call Hawkers Go Digital. And the essence of it is to understand that every business, however small, what are some of those basic digital tools that they can onboard that help them to have more market reach and access, but at the same time really thinking about the pain points. Now, when you go to these small businesses, the biggest pain points are going to be access to low capital. And so how do you ensure that by giving them the digital solutions, you're also addressing their biggest pain points, which is a bigger market that they would like to reach, which is access to financing and capital, and then the inventory management so that they're connected to the different supply chains. And so I think it's really designing those digital solutions that are not just allowing them to go digital, but they're also responding to some of the biggest pain points that they have as they think about scaling their businesses.
I've enjoyed hearing about solutions from this panel in particular. We set out to talk about the challenges, but I'm really grateful and optimistic that we've laid out some of the solutions, and I hope if we reconvene in a year, we'll have even more great case studies to share. I want to thank Hakeem Steiner, Rima Qureshi, Minister Paula, and Devin for this wonderful panel, and thank all of you for your participation and your great questions. Enjoy the rest of your annual meeting.
Thank you.